Welcome to Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Carol Massar.
And I'm Jason Kelly. We're here inside Bloomberg headquarters in New York City.
This week, a coronavirus special report.
The outbreak, it's now a pandemic, according to the WHO.
That and President Trump's travel ban from Europe to the United States rattled global markets that were already on edge.
And as of March 10th, more than 100 nations had reported infections and almost 4,000 people had died. This week, Business Week asks, what will this all mean?
We do indeed. We do begin, though, with the economy and now what is officially a bear market. Mike Regan, who follows the stock market for us, joins us. He has a story in the magazine on what happened to the bull market. We talked, it was the longest on record. We all talked about at some point it would have to come to an end. I don't think we envisioned this.
Right. Well, what's amazing to me is how many threats were thrown at this bull market over the years. You know, I look back at 2011 when the U.S. lost its AAA credit rating at S&P, to the European debt crisis, all the various geopolitical dust-ups in the meantime, the crash in oil prices in 2016, on and on. And it got very close to sort of hitting that 20% drop that would sort of signal the end of a bull market and the start of a bear market. But both times in 2011 and again in 2018, it stopped just short of that, like 19 point something percent.
Came so close,
So
right?
close. And it really made you sort of think, well, investors had kind of put some orders in to buy near those levels, thinking that, you know, this thing can survive almost anything, it felt like. Clearly, the economic damage being done from this virus is just so great. It's so unquantifiable right now. We know the damage is being done. How bad it is, how bad the effect on earnings and everything is just so unquantifiable that this appears to be what's really going to do the trick and finally end this record-long bull market.
When ultimately, investors are betting on the future in many ways. And one of the things that they're not hearing from companies, and one of the things that seems to be really spooking everyone, is instead of companies saying, well, it's going to take earnings down or it's going to take revenues down X percent or X much, they're saying, we don't know.
Right. Just withdrawing guidance. So it's almost a worse scenario than saying a drop, predicting a drop of X percent. And it's understandable. I mean, how can a company possibly in good faith tell you what their earnings are going to be, or even a wide range, when there's so much uncertainty, so much unpredictability about this virus, how long it's going to last, how long this travel ban is going to be enforced, on and on and on, all the way up and down the markets. It's just impossible to price the equity market.
Well, a bear market is one thing, a recession is something else altogether.
Right.
What are you hearing from investors and folks you talk to internally, externally, about the chances of the U.S. especially slipping into recession?
It's more and more becoming sort of the consensus that we'll likely see a recession. So far, I think most people believe it'll be a shallow one, maybe only a quarter or two. To me, the big question is, the contagion from the damage being done right now, how far does it go as far as credit markets? Do we see a big spike in defaults and in bankruptcies? And then it goes from being this health crisis to a crisis more similar to 2008. And that could take a long time to recover from.
And Mike, watching that corporate debt picture and seeing which companies are more vulnerable, that's certainly an important part of the story. Mike Regan, thank you so much. Well, financial markets, just one part of this fast-moving story. We should point out our interviews and coverage, while they were up to date as of our tapings.
And no one knew more about how fast-moving a story this was and is than the editor of the magazine, that's Joel Weber. For more on the coronavirus special report issue, it was a takeover. Joel joins us now. The lost year.
Yeah, that's right. So when we thought about how to do this issue, we started actually relatively small, and then we just kept getting more ambitious as we kept seeing some of the stories come in and kept asking questions. So that idea of asking questions is actually the way that we frame the whole book. We started from the macro, what does this mean for the global economy, and worked down from there through governments, companies, us as individuals in society, and all the way down to the virus itself, right? So that was our lens, and then we just asked questions again and again and again. But the overarching idea is really this idea of the lost year, right? Of like, we don't know what this means right now or how bad it will get, but everything, and especially as this became a pandemic, officially in a pandemic now,
right.
All projections out the window, and no one can even know if their kid's going to go to a summer camp, right?
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of macro, though, in terms of big perspectives, I mean, global policymakers and monetary bank officials all trying to figure out what's the right policy at this time.
Elected officials, tyrants, everyone trying to figure out what they're supposed to do about this, because look, like, this is unprecedented in sort of its global reach now. And everyone's trying to grasp, what it really means and how we're supposed to address this from a policy perspective. I think what we're seeing is in the East, especially in Asia, there was a real ability to like crack down on this, do some draconian measures. Singapore, even where you have a small island nation being able to actually raise efforts and just really lock things down, is going to be dramatically different than what the West is going to be able to do. And what we've seen in Italy may foreshadow what we could end up seeing throughout Europe and maybe even North America.
Well, you talk a lot about daily life. You and I were talking throughout the week from a sports perspective about the NCAA tournament, going fanless, the NBA season being suspended, much more to come. Daily life is being affected. That plays through the broader consumer economy, right?
Absolutely, right? And even how you do your job, are you going to be able to work from home? Companies grappling with this ability of saying, like, look, like everyone work from home, and then realizing maybe only executives are in a place that they can work from home, and rank and file have to actually show up and do their job until there's official measures that that come down.
Joel Weber, thank you so much. We're going to have more coming up from the Lost Year issue, including how to fight the coronavirus without harming the global economy.
It's a great story. Plus, as factories come back online in China, is that a sure safe sign that China's economy will actually bounce back?
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Welcome back to Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carol Masser. Join us for Bloomberg Business Week every day on the radio starting at 2 p.m. Wall Street time. You can also catch up on our daily show by listening to our podcast.
And you can find us online at businessweek.com, on our mobile app, and you can watch us every day on YouTube.
Back to our special report. When the coronavirus strikes, the worst damage is done by the body's effort to fight off the disease. The immune system, it overreacts.
And some critics say that's exactly what's happening with the global economy. They say the effort to fight the disease is hurting growth more than the disease itself.
Here's economics editor Peter Coy with his cover story and this week's Business Week Explainer.
China is an example of the economic damage done by COVID-19. New cases in China are falling, which is great, but it required the most extensive quarantine in history in Hubei province. Almost 60 million people were corralled. The measures were almost as tough in other provinces. As a result, according to Bloomberg Economics, China's economy will grow just 1.2% in the first quarter from a year ago. That would be the lowest growth on record. In the U.S., the stock market swoon is not only a symptom of the virus, it's also a cause of harm to the economy. More and more economists are predicting that the U.S. will fall into recession. In fact, it's possible that one has already begun, ending the longest expansion in U.S. history. One possible remedy, some say to take extreme precautions for the most vulnerable, such as nursing home residents, and to keep factories, offices, and schools open where possible, while of course emphasizing hand washing, physical separation, and paid sick leave for people who might be carrying the virus.
And for more on the cover story and what this will do to the economy, here's Peter.
The question is, and you said the question of 2020 is, how are we collectively, meaning the human race, going to manage to fight off the virus as we must without destroying everything else we care about, the economy, our family lives, and so on?
And one of the interesting things about this economic moment, and you quote Mark Zandi, well-known guy over at Moody's, chief economist, he says we could be moving from a self-reinforcing positive cycle to a self-reinforcing negative cycle. And that seems to be such a key insight here.
Yeah, because what is a recession? A recession is when you lose faith in the future and you don't invest for the future if you're a business. You don't buy if you're a consumer. You hunker down. And that very act of hunkering down, which is trying to protect you from the recession, itself can trigger the recession, because what works for one family or one company doesn't work collectively when everybody tries to do it at once. This is what John Maynard Keynes called the paradox of thrift.
That is fascinating,
Yeah.
the theory of it. I do wonder, Peter, can we use, or how do we look at China in terms of what they have been doing? Is
It's
it a cautionary
fascinating.
tale?
I don't know how to judge China, because on the one hand, the number of cases they're reporting is way, way down.
Yeah.
And you have to think that's good news. It's good news for the Chinese,
Right.
potentially very good news for the rest of the world, if indeed it's replicable. So two things. One is, will China's have a rebound of cases as they gear up, go back to normal life, reopen factories and businesses, and people start communicating again, and
That's a huge unknown, and we really haven't talked about that, but that's a huge unknown.
It is, and I don't know the answer either, but I'm extremely curious. I think the world should be intensely watching China's experience, whether to get new flare-ups. The second thing is a little more predictable, which is that the rest of the world is probably not going to be able to do what China has done. I mean, China is a authoritarian police state with high-tech surveillance capabilities.
Right.
They can shut things down in a way that other countries can't. I look at the case of Italy, where the prime minister wants to shut down the entire country. I mean,
And effectively has.
yeah, well, that's legally has. Whether it's going to work in practice is, to me, a great unknown. I just don't think Italy has either the technology or the culture to do what the Chinese did in Hubei province.
Well, you heard Peter mention workers returning to factories in China, and that raises another question. How quickly will the world's second largest economy bounce back?
And as we found out from economics editor Christina Lindblad, the answer, not so clear.
Everybody is watching to see how soon the world's number 2 economy gets back on its feet, because it's important to just about every country. They're also also curiosity about how companies negotiate some of these obstacles. For example, there are now like rules in China about how close workers can sit at lunchtime, at their desk. But so basically, analysts, ours, and at other banks on Wall Street and companies have been looking at statistics in China to try to gauge how quickly industry and factories are coming back online. Now, that's a tricky thing because for a long time there have been suspicions that, the government fudges its numbers.
Right, it's tricky in normal times.
Right. So, but because of that, though, people have these sort of proxy data sets that they track. And one of them is energy, and they've looked at those for a long time. So now people, for example, are looking at like thermal coal, which is used, for electricity production, to see what is consumption of thermal coal telling me about how quickly the plants are coming back to life.
Even that.
Yeah, even that hasn't been totally reliable, because we have now seen from interviews with plant managers is that in several prefectures, government officials handed out targets for, for energy consumption. So that means that sometimes factory owners were going in, turning on all the lights, running the machinery, even if they didn't have all of their workers back to actually be able to, really be doing full production again.
One of the things you point out in this story, which is really important, is the size of the economy, but also the size of the downturn here and the historical perspective there. You guys say it's the first quarterly contraction in decades we're likely to see, and the weakest year since the early 1990s for China. That's a long time.
Yeah, and not only that, but the historical comparisons, you also have to consider the fact that like a decade ago, China's contribution to the world economy was much smaller. So,
That's a good point.
All of these, businesses, there's like all of these networks that have built up. Like, so this transmission effects that are going on kind of backwards and forwards along these business relationships, right? That's what people are beginning to caution about now, that it's going to sort of amplify the downturns in some places, and that where people are just going to try to, get a grip on that.
Up next, more from our coronavirus special report. We ask, are businesses ready?
And the hunt for a cure. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carol Masser. You can also listen to Bloomberg Business Week on the radio on SiriusXM Channel 119 and on AM 1130 in New York, 106.1 in Boston, 99.1 FM in Washington, D.C.
AM 960 in the Bay Area and London on DAB Digital and through the Bloomberg Business app.
And of course, you can watch us daily on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com, search Bloomberg Global News. Turning to the business section of our coronavirus special report, two stories to highlight. One on price gouging.
And another on how the pandemic is disrupting supply chains. Here's business editor Jim Ellis.
One of the things about globalism is that it's allowed you to have supply chains that stretch across borders and allow you to do millions of things with people who are making things for you 12 time zones away. And so we looked at Peugeot, which is building cars with, and it's got 4,000 parts, but it also has, 6,000, sort of companies that it buys from.
Right.
Many of those are in China. And so what it discovered is, since Wuhan, where the virus started, is also the center of sort of auto parts manufacturing for much of Asia, they discovered, they had to identify the people who in their supply chain who might not be able to, continue to supply on time. And they had to scramble, looking for ways to sort of have substitutes for those. What that meant was that a lot of things are just made in China. What they found was they went back and found the old stamps for making some of the machinery that went to China, and then they are actually making machinery, making parts much slower than at a Chinese plant, but making parts with some of those old stamps just to kind of make up for things now. They're also taking other plants across Europe, where Peugeot is based,
right,
in France and other parts of Europe, to make things that the Chinese made. Now, this is going to be slower, and it's probably going to be more expensive,
right,
but what it means is that they are able to continue production even though important parts of the supply chain are stopped.
For the moment, and one of the things that they discovered in one particular case was the backup to China was Milan.
Right. And that is a problem because for a lot of European makers, northern Italy is a big place for making parts. And now that we've had disruptions there, and particularly the lockdown in the last couple of days, people are having to scramble then to look for other ways to do this.
Right.
This is not going to work out well. Only thing, and it's not a positive, but at least one thing that's going to happen is probably demand is going to drop in parts of Europe where things are locked down. A lot of people are not going to be going out to buy cars. And so in some ways, it's this mixed blessing. It's going to slow down the demand for cars. And so therefore, the lower production numbers that you're having because of a disrupted supply chain are not going to hurt you as bad as if everyone was going out shopping.
Another story in the section has to do with price gouging. We're starting to see that with items like Clorox wipes or anti-bac, and this story looks into what's going on there and whether we can police it.
Yeah. One of the problems is that most companies love when business goes up, and there's more demand. What they don't like, and they're usually not prepared for, is when business spikes. In other words, what we've been seeing for things like masks and wipes, the increases in thousands of percent.
Right.
It's not as if, I have a 10% increase, I can maybe add 3 people to my line.
Straight line up in terms of demand.
Up. And so how do you deal with that? So a lot of companies are ending up with trouble, being able to stock their regular customers, and a lot of people, particularly in the online world, are taking advantage of that by raising prices.
Right.
But not raising prices in a small way, but sort of doubling, tripling prices. I think a lot of people have seen that things like on Amazon, where you see $300 Purell, $400 Purell, when it should cost $8, $10.
Right.
And so that we think of that as price gouging. But price gouging, it turns out, is a lot difficult. It's difficult to figure out exactly what it is, and it's really hard to stop.
Right. And regulators and lawmakers are really wrestling with this, A, sort of getting out ahead of it, but B, also figuring out, well, what do we go after? What do we not go after? What does the market need to take care of, and what do we need to take care of?
Yeah, we figured out that most likely the regulators aren't going to be able to stop this for a lot of reasons. Consumer laws in most states are pretty weak when it comes to this, and even laws that snap in and say, you shouldn't have this kind of predatory pricing, they do it after an emergency has been declared, and usually by that time, the prices are already up.
Right.
And so you say, okay, you can't raise it, but it's already at $300, so what? But it also turns out that a lot of times the pricing that we see online that we think of as predatory pricing or price gouging is sometimes driven by the pricing models that you have to have in the online world. I find this fascinating. It turns out that at Amazon, for a person who is a seller there, they are penalized in Amazon's world by being out of stock. And so you never want to be out of stock. So what they've done is their own pricing models, their own software sort of says the less stock I have, raise the prices so they'll slow down sales so that I won't go out of stock, and then I'll be penalized for Amazon. Right. So what happens is those last few items suddenly become a lot more expensive, and they consciously didn't try to do that, but they're trying desperately not to run afoul of the algorithms at Amazon.
In business and investing, everyone respects the human and economic toll of the virus, but at the same time, got to point out, some do find some opportunities.
That's what the markets are all about. We spoke with ARK Investments Management CEO and CIO Cathie Wood on our daily Business Week radio show.
During times of turbulence, innovation actually gains traction and market share. And I can give you two tangible examples from 08-09. We thought the world was falling apart. Tech budgets were cut by 20-30%, right? Right. Salesforce.com's worst quarter from a revenue growth point of view, worst, was up 20%. Amazon's worst quarter was up 14%. And in this particular crisis, we saw the sequencing of that virus, of the coronavirus, COVID-19, in 2 days. For SARS in 2003, it took, I think it took 5 months before they could even figure out what it was. Right? We had 2 days, and now, of course, we're accelerating the timeline to trials for vaccines, and then the scaling of vaccines. That's going to take time, for sure, but I think we'll have a vaccine for the next flu season.
So how do you invest in a time like this?
We concentrate our portfolios toward our highest conviction names. And towards these names generally are going to be a part of the solution. So you talk about supply chain. 3D printing has taken a long time to take off. It's been, if you look at some of those stocks, for 6 years.
Right.
Okay. Now remember, we've talked about Tesla a lot in the past, and I always used to say, I look at a base like that, and that effectively is the bulls and the bears fighting each other. There's a big controversy, right? And bases either break out or they break down. In the case of Tesla, we're saying, watch out, this is a big base, this is going to be a big breakout. I would maintain the same for 3D printing stocks. Now, it's a little different because the industrial sector isn't as, it's more methodical, it isn't as quick as break things in the tech world, right? But we do know the aerospace world, which is going to be in a world of trouble here. They've got to cut their costs. They've got to cut their costs. And with 3D printing, not only can you cut costs, and they're printing engine parts now you can cut costs by 75% plus, but you're also shrinking the form factors or lightening the weight of the planes as well. So bringing many more efficiencies.
And you can hear more from Cathie Wood. She's on our Business Week Extra podcast because we talked about fintech, biotech, and that's certainly a big part of the virus story, and how financial market disruption can lead to innovation. So there's a lot there.
Also Tesla, she's been one of the biggest bulls on the street. So you're going to want to check that out. Again, get that wherever you get your podcasts. Up next, coronavirus travel slump and the potential fallout for airline and hotel industries.
And how people are changing their behavior to stay healthy. This is Bloomberg Business Week. Welcome back to Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Carol Massar.
And I'm Jason Kelly. Still ahead, what it means to keep a social distance in public spaces.
Or should you just simply work from home to help fight the spread of the virus?
And the crisis slams the travel industry.
It's all part of our special report this week. Editor Pat Regnier joining us now on putting together the issue. So Pat, there was so much for you guys to get into and what was a fast and rapidly moving story. How did you structure it?
Well, we started by just thinking of it in terms of scale. So we started with kind of the big picture, literally macroeconomics. Then we moved on to government, and then we started to look at how is this affecting individual businesses. And then we really got to the heart of the story, which is the people that it's affecting. And then all the way down to the microbe, and like looking at the virus and what we know about it, which is in many ways the most challenging part because there's still so much we don't know about it and how it's working epidemiologically and sort of what's going to happen.
Well, and what was interesting too for us to sort of watch pretty close at hand, and we're talking to you guys all throughout the week on our daily show as well, is this was, I mean, beyond a team effort in many ways, really leveraging the entire Bloomberg empire in many ways because this is a global pandemic, emphasis on global.
This is a global story, and we really felt strongly that one of the things that we could do was to get people to look outside of the United States and to see where this is already happening. I think a lot of us feel like, this is a fast-moving public health story. This is a time when people are going to have to work together, and I think a part of that is to actually see what's happening, both to maybe get a sense of what's coming, but also to get a sense of some of the human experiences that people are having there. Some of the stories we have in the magazine are truly heartbreaking.
I was going to say, what struck you about the coverage this week?
Well, one of the stories that a lot of the editors have talked the most about is a story about a family in China where they've really just sort of seen the family decimated. We talked to a woman, she lost both her mother and her grandmother. As they were facing shortages of hospitals, they simply couldn't get beds. And the last time she spoke to her mother was very sick and wasn't able to talk to her, and they weren't able to get her the care she needed. And she spoke to her mother in anger because she was so frustrated at what happened. And that was the last conversation she had had. And it was a very dramatic story, and we're beginning to see that unfold in Italy as well. And we're all kind of thinking about, is this system here in the United States and in other parts of the world prepared for the strain that's to come? And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to understand what we know about the course of the virus and how it spreads.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit because you guys do go down all the way to the microbial level in some ways to understand some of the science, to help us understand and viewers and listeners and readers understand the science. What struck you about that?
So one of the things that really struck us was you do have to think about, as we're all washing our hands and social distancing from one another, why are we doing that? Some people take reassurance, and maybe too much reassurance, from the fact that if you're relatively young, if you're healthy, it's unlikely that you'll get very sick. But a part of what we're doing as we're all washing our hands is not taking care of ourselves, but taking care of the other people around us. Trying to slow the spread, and that's what gets back to this thing about the healthcare system. The more you can slow the spread, even if ultimately the raw numbers of people who get it are very high, what will really matter is the timing. Are there beds? Are there ventilators? My wife happens to be a nurse, and we're seeing this firsthand. We're already beginning to see some of the strains in the system.
Jason and I have been lucky enough to actually spend some time with one of the doctors out on the West Coast that's part of that Seattle hospital system, which has been kind of ground zero and where the first patient happened. One of the things that we've heard is the inability to get test kits, and everybody's working on a vaccination, but it takes time. And you guys get into this, which I think is so crucial to understanding this story.
It's so important to have the tests, both so that we have a sense of like what is the actual case fatality of this. I mean, you don't really know what the fatality rate is until you actually know how many people have it, how many people get it. But also, again, so that you can direct care to people, so that you can know what to do with people who are the worried well. If you have a cold, should you come to work? It would help to know if you only have a cold.
Right. Well, and one of the things you talk about, which was a surprising story and an eye-opening one for me at least, is the availability of a specific type of mice in order to test for a vaccine.
Right. So we have a story about sort of the struggle to, find this specific sort of mouse in order to do this testing. Other places in Bloomberg are looking at, they're doing some testing in baboons. Carol, I know that you've recently talked to people at healthcare companies who are talking about we need the reagents to run these tests. The whole system is straining to find this. We had in more than one place in the magazine people talking about how we're working 14, 18-hour days. Ordinarily when we're doing a magazine, we would find things that are repeating and we would take it out and we would only have it in one place. In this thing, we were looking at something so unique. It's like, over here, people are working 14 and 18-hour days. Over here, people are working 14 and 18-hour days. Every time someone told us, wash your hands, cover your cough. We left that in the magazine.
Yeah.
You'll read it about 100 times in our magazine this week, and we think it really matters.
It's incredible coverage.
It really is amazing. It's one of those things that really gives you such a holistic view. Pat Regnier, the architect of this special takeover issue. Coming up, staying healthy in those public spaces.
Plus, how the virus is hurting airlines and hotels. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carol Massar. Join Bloomberg Business Week every day on the radio starting at 2 p.m. Wall Street time. You can also catch up on our daily show by listening to our podcast.
And you can find us online at businessweek.com and through our mobile app. And you can watch us on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com and search Bloomberg Global News.
Will airlines regain altitude? It is a story in the magazine's coronavirus special report.
President Donald Trump's 30-day ban on Europeans traveling to the United States delivered a hammer blow to airlines already facing $113 billion in lost revenue worldwide this year because of the coronavirus.
For more on how the pandemic is hitting that industry specifically, let's bring in Kaylee Lyons. Man, this is one industry that is hurting big time.
There's really no way to sugarcoat it, right? I mean, the outlook for these guys is just so bleak. When I looked at the Bloomberg World Airline Index, so far this year, it has lost almost $100 billion in market cap. This is a group extremely under pressure. Of course, you have just travel demand declining. It's actually expected to fall this year for the first time since 2009, plus these travel curbs. And what that means, and what I'm looking at here on this chart, is that earnings estimates for these groups have fallen dramatically, especially so for the Asia Pacific region. Those full service carriers have seen earnings revised lower by about 50%. For Europe, about 18%, a little less so for the North American airlines. But as you alluded to with Trump's travel ban, this picture could get even worse. That affects 3,500 flights a day.
Well, and that's a really important point because as we've seen this virus move around the world, the biggest impact initially was in Asia. You see that happening, and so you do wonder, as you say, whether this picture gets a lot worse for Europe and North America.
Right, because it's not just about shutting down, airlines in your country, but it's people moving back and forth. So even as the virus moves, it just stops all the travel from happening.
Right, exactly. I mean, we're talking about thousands and thousands of flights over this 30-day period.
All right.
It get very bad.
Kaylee Lyons, thank you so much. Well, it's not just the airline industry, the hotel industry also hard hit.
We spoke with Jay Stein, CEO of Dream Hotel Group, on the impact of the coronavirus. We caught up with him on our daily Business Week radio and YouTube broadcast.
Most of it has been, precautionary. I think if you look at the numbers, the actual numbers, they're still very low, but we're not sure where they're going to head. And in this modern era, people have been told to be cautious and less travel and less movement around and less need for hotels. So we're really seeing an impact now.
So wait, you have hotels in Nashville, Hollywood, New York City, Miami, Thailand. Tell me about Thailand.
And New York.
And New York. And New York, yes. Oh, I thought I said New York. Okay, sorry. New York City. So Thailand, tell me about that specifically.
So that hotel, the business has been off probably about 50% over the last month or so. And I think, it's stabilized now, and I think we'll start to see things start to move back up.
It has stabilized?
Yeah, I think it's stabilized. It's not dropping anymore. Those occupancy
Are
levels.
people coming in? Are you starting to? Most of the people who come to your places in Thailand, where are they coming from?
So it's a fair amount of domestic and Asia-driven business.
Okay.
Business from other Asian countries.
So any signs in terms of business people looking to book in a couple months, later this year?
Yeah, so as I said, I still think we're about 50% off from where we would normally be.
Okay.
But I don't see it dropping significantly more at this point. So kind of leveling off at that range from about 50% of where we'd normally be. But we'll see if that holds and if it starts to move.
And so so do you just start to see it in cancellations? Do you start to see it, sort of to Carol's question, in sort of behavior, where people are coming from? I mean, you guys have a lot of data at your disposal. I do wonder, as you go a level down, what do you see?
So it starts with the group bookings.
Yeah.
So those are, the furthest out and the biggest numbers and the ones that need to be a little more cautionary. So once we see the group numbers starting to take impact, and those go quick because, if you drop 6-7 groups of 30, 40, 50 people a night for 4 or 5 nights each, you're dropping, $500,000 in an hour. And so we've been seeing a fair amount of group cancellations particularly this week here in the States.
I also got a chance to sit down with Dexter Roberts. He is a fellow at the University of Montana, author of a new book. It's called The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. Also, it was a bit of a homecoming. He's a former China bureau chief here at Business Week. We talked a lot about the coronavirus and how that speaks to some structural problems in the Chinese economy.
The basic idea, or the myth of the title, is this idea that China is becoming more capitalistic, that China is continuing on this reform path that started way back under Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah.
And continuing, the myth is that China will continue to grow its middle class. And yes.
All right. So I'm going to stop you there only to say, what does the last 3 months mean for that?
Well, so we were talking coronavirus.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. So, I mean, I think that what some of the arguments I make in the book about at the other China, the migrant workers and the farmers, their cousins in the countryside, which, by the way, is about 500 million people. So we're getting close to half the population. They've been long treated.
More people than live in the United States.
Yes, considerably more than live in the United States. Well, for a long time, they've in effect been treated as second-class citizens. They don't have access to the same health care. They don't have access to the same education. On average, they're making less than roughly a third of urban incomes, and there's policies that keep them in that position, which we can get into later. But that relationship between the people in the city and these second-class citizens has really been brought home. I mean, the unequal relationship has really been brought home by the coronavirus, because even as cities in Beijing seem to be returning to some degree, normalcy is not the right word, but things are a little more regular there. If you're a white-collar worker, you're working from home, you're going into the office sometimes. Things are a little more normal. Companies are reopening. That's not happening for these people, these migrants and rural people.
Right. And so you were in Beijing for 23 years. You were in Taiwan before that. How did this story change? How did your thesis evolve, or what did you see happen over that period? Because that 23 years, it just ended for you just a couple of years ago. I mean, what a period in the history of the country.
Yes. I mean, when I arrived in, I think it was January of 1995 in Beijing, and, the economy was somewhere in the bottom of the top 10 economies in the world, I think. There wasn't really a consumer economy. There really wasn't. I mean, the car sales were 85% government and fleet sales for big state enterprises. There weren't people buying cars. There was no housing market, really. There was no housing market until later reforms happened in the late 90s. So the place was transformed. WTO entry in 2001, which I covered for Business Week, was a real seminal moment, obviously bringing in enormous amounts of investment and really transforming the economy and bringing this factory to the world export model into its full character.
Coming up, we'll give you some tips about how to stay healthy in public spaces.
Plus, should more of us simply work from home?
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Welcome back to Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carol Masser. You can also listen to us on the radio on SiriusXM Channel 119 and on AM 1130 in New York, 106.1 in Boston, 99.1 FM in Washington, D.C.
AM 960 in the Bay Area, in London on DAB Digital and through the Bloomberg Business app. And you can watch us on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com and search Bloomberg Global News.
We turn now to the What Should You Do section of the magazine's coronavirus special report. It's a photo essay on staying safe in public spaces.
And joining us is Jane Yeomans. She helped to put together all the visuals for the issue. It's magnificent, I have to say. Yeah. Really an amazing work of art throughout. Tell us how you did it.
Well, it was a huge group effort, as you can imagine, and it was a colossal newsroom effort, I think, across Bloomberg, Business Week. We had writers globally, photographers globally. We started pulling images, we started assigning images, and as the stories kept evolving and changing, we kept reassigning and collecting. So we spent most of a week doing that.
Jane, just next to us, I mean, we've got some images that we're, showing on air, and it's just, I thought about this. I ride mass transportation. I've been watching around. I tweeted out this morning about the number of masks I saw, but it, was such a simple piece of advice, but you really did wonder, right? Something that you do without thinking, grabbing things, holding things. Right. Now you thought twice about it, and the images are just so telling.
Yeah, Gus Powell is one of the best street photographers. He's known for his street photography. And we hired him to go around to the places he often shoots for his own work, and which is the financial area, Herald Square, and had him kind of watch people, what they were doing, were they wearing masks, how were they touching poles, and then he also rode the subway. And for me also, as a subway rider, a bus rider, a bike rider, I think about this a lot, watching the people, how are they holding it, their elbow, how I hold things, how I touch things.
Right.
So
that's such a telling one with just a little finger holding the subway bar.
Yeah, and we ended up making a photo essay of all the different holding devices, as it were, like one glove, one finger, elbow, and it turned out to be a really beautiful photo essay.
Right, it really does capture this moment in time. Talk to us about the covers, because there's one for each region. Arresting images, to say the least, really eye-catching and capturing again sort of this moment that we're living in. You worked directly on that. Tell us about how you chose the images.
Well, I didn't directly choose them. It was really a group effort. And we all
Which speaks to what went on in the magazine this week. Everything was so much of a group effort.
I've worked on a lot of these special issues, and I work, every week on the magazine, but this was truly a huge group effort. And we collected images, and one of our photo editors had found a photographer in Wuhan that's the cover on the right, the Wuhan cover, who had been there when they closed down the city and had him reshoot recent images. So we ended up doing a photo essay inside of that as well. And then the Italian, we were looking at all the different countries. We were looking at Milan, we were looking at Rome. And at first we were going to do Milan, but then it was Venice, and then it was Rome. So we kept collecting images, and we tried to collect images from photographers on the ground. I assigned a photographer in Seattle last weekend, but I gathered things from all the photographers that were there, and that ended up being the cover on the left. And a photographer had reached out to me cold and asked me if I wanted her to do a project, and I said no, but if you have anything of empty streets, send them. And I just let her know last night when we finally made a decision that was her cover, and she was thrilled because she's a Bloomberg fan, you know. So
I will say, from talking to folks and anybody from Seattle, they did say that anytime they went, around town, they said it was like a ghost town. So that really, that image tells, it's not just one moment in time, but it's what we've been seeing in Seattle for some time because of the virus.
Yeah, and it was a huge collective effort with art and photo, and editorial. We looked at covers a lot and tried to figure out what's the best image to tell the story without laying blame on China. And the Seattle one, a lot of what we all loved about it is very abstract. Like, people that know Seattle would know that, but it's also like an empty street, and there's a man on the corner, and it's sort of, there's no horizon line. So it creates a very evocative.
I wasn't sure initially where it was.
It could be Hong Kong. It looks like it could be a lot of or Europe. So that felt the strongest for all of us, and I was really happy with that because I love an evocative image.
All right, well, it's an amazing body of work, all collected in this week's issue. Like you said, a big team effort. Grateful to you, Jane Yeomans. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Well, cleanliness on the subway, that's one strategy to stop the spread. Also, working from home.
I spoke with Justin Fox from his home and how it could be your own little contribution to lowering the reproduction number of the virus. It's called R-Naught.
R-Naught is basically the infectiousness of a disease. It's how many people each person with a disease can be expected to infect. So if it's above 1, the disease spreads. If it's below 1, it doesn't spread. And every disease sort of they estimate what the R-Naught is if nobody changes their behavior. And for the coronavirus, it's pretty high. It seems to be between 2 and 3, whereas for influenza, most estimates are usually down in the 1s. And so the issue is, it's different for different kinds of diseases, but kind of the basic elements of what make up the R-Naught are: how long does the infection last, how infectious is the disease when you have contact with a person, and how many people do you have contact with? And we can affect that, how infectious when we have contact with a lot of the things like washing our hands and not touching our faces and things like that. But then a lot of it is just if you reduce the number of people having contact with each other, if your society has social distancing, then the R naught goes down. And in China, they reduced people's contact with each other to almost nothing, and the R naught of the disease went below 1. It may go back up again now that there are people out and about. And I mean, the other thing I would say is we're still not there that it's completely uncontrollable. I mean, South Korea has shown that you can get a lot of cases, and if you have enough testing and and the public health authorities are very aggressive, you can sort of bring it back in check. But that goes hand in hand with measures to keep R naught down.
Well, and it's interesting. I do think about this, this is our version of the Chinese quarantine. If you stay at home, you're kind of self-quarantining yourself and keeping yourself out of the public. It's not just about protecting yourself, but if you're not, I think about this when I look at the subways, I feel like the traffic is way down, but you're protecting others who you might come into contact with, especially when you're dealing with something like mass transportation.
Yeah, and the subway's less crowded now. Yeah, if people aren't as squeezed as close together in the subway or in the office or in the soup line at Bloomberg headquarters, then there's a little bit less risk. I mean, it's not like I'm doing some heroic thing here,
right?
But it does reduce everybody's risk a tiny bit.
Right. It's so simplistic that I love it. But what's interesting, and you caught on to a stat that I saw too that was being tweeted around this week, and it has to do, I think it was Bureau of Labor Statistics data based on a census, about only 29% of U.S. workers have the option of working from home. I mean, those folks in higher level jobs, management jobs, it's a lot easier to stay at home.
Yeah, of management and sort of, I forget their exact classification, but it's like management, financial, business jobs. It's about 60% people say they can work at home.
Bloomberg Business Week, this special edition, it's available on newsstands now.
Also online at businessweek.com and on our mobile app. And typically at this point, Jason and I talk about our must-reads, but I've got to say that I think everyone should read the entire issue because there's so much information and reminds us that this story, the virus, is impacting us on so many different levels, policy levels, business levels, financial market levels, and individuals.
Well, absolutely. And the whole notion of going from macro to micro, literally, understanding the economics of it, but also the science underneath it, all the way down to the mice shortage. It's pretty amazing.
And I do think that science aspect of this story is a really important one so that we really truly understand what the virus is, how it spreads, and what can be done to really fight it. And I think that's getting a little bit lost in all of the headlines and worries that are generally impacting our world.
All right, you should also check out our daily Business Week podcast. This week, we catch up with Kathy Wood about coronavirus and a lot more. You can also watch us on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com and search Bloomberg Global News.
More Bloomberg Television starts now.